First, I would like to thank you very much for creating that post-talk. It's quite important for the discipline, I think. So let's start right now. So 30 years ago, Roger Bagnall summarized the historical knowledge of the 4th century Egypt in a work that remains a cornerstone today. He explored society, economy, and culture through written evidence preserved on papyri and ostraca, while lamenting the lack of archaeological data to complement his study. The 4th century was first and foremost the one of literate urban populations, state institutions, armies, and flourishing Christian communities. Nearly 15 years later, following the Egypt in the Byzantine World Colloquium, the same author gathered contributions that updated the documentation and, for the first time, confirmed the growing importance of archaeology in the historical study of late antique and Byzantine Egypt. Excavation. Sorry, I can't hear you.
No, please continue. Don't worry.
Okay. So excavations across Egypt has significantly enriched the archaeological sources, and research had become more specialized in fields such as architecture, ceremology, and funerary anthropology, contributing to an abundance of new information. In recent decades, the exploration of the Western deserts and the renewed interest in Christian archaeology have addressed previous gaps in documentation, both in quantity and quality. These developments now allow us to compare sources and revisit earlier conclusions based on textual documentation alone. It is with this objective that the DEChriM project was launched by Victor Gica in 2019. Primarily focused on the rise of Christianity, the project aims to consolidate all available data, fostering a multidisciplinary approach to renewing our understanding of the 4th century AD. One of the key archaeological challenges of this project is to identify the remains from the period, whether through archaeological and architectural analysis, radiocarbon dating, or the study of ceramic assemblages. The research that I will present today was driven by the need to obtain as clear a picture as possible of ceramic production circulating in the 4th century, in order to identify potential chronological markers that could assist in dating archaeological remains in the field. The request was, in a sense, that of a historian, used to operate within a such precise time frame. For a ceramic specialist, however, this presents a challenge, as we are trained to work with assemblages that don't conform to such strict chronological boundaries. Ceramics do not easily align with the arbitrary division of centuries. They often fall into an indeterminate range, early, middle, or late in a century, and sometimes even spanning 2 or 3 centuries. This imprecision reflects both the inherent caution of specialists in the light of the current state of art of the discipline and an objective reality of ceramic production. Working on this project meant reconciling the historical timelines with the necessarily different scale of ceramic production. It required carefully selecting, rejecting, or accepting the idea that a specific production of or ceramic type fits within the defined window of the 4th century. Remains of the 4th century itself are scarce. However, numerous sites reveal longer histories that include episodes potentially datable to this period, while others offer such limited information that their chronological horizon spans 2 or 3 centuries within the 4th century position somewhere within. Given the purpose of this research and its narrow chronological framework, the first step is to examine these data in detail in order to assess their reliability and to prioritize the context on which this study is based. Chronological hypotheses are based on the documentary sources used by those working on the field, numismatists, papyrologists, architects, and of course, ceramic specialists. I will therefore focus first on the documentary sources used to date the remains. Non-ceramic materials will be included in the general discussion, with a more specific focus on ceramic documentation. The attribution of Romain to the 4th century is rarely based on laboratory dating methods such as radiocarbon dating. As samples could only be analyzed on Egyptian territory, it was not until a laboratory was set up at the IFAO in Cairo that this technique could be used by current archaeological missions. The practice is now becoming more widespread and provides relatively reliable information. Architecture is one element that can potentially support a dating to the 4th century, especially for a Christian or military building. For example, the first Hermitage in the Kelia or in Ganu-Kasrelaguz were partially buried into the geological substratum, while later buildings were constructed on the surface. The churches that can be dated to the 4th century do not seem to follow a strict plan, each one having its own peculiarities, even if a general outline has been established. As a result, coins and text have contributed much more to their dating than their architectural form. The forts and other fortified structures built in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries as part of an effort to reorganize Egypt's defensive system have in common a quadrilateral shape flanked by towers, some of which have a unique U-shape. The list of these buildings is constantly growing, especially as a result of the exploration of Western oases. This first exploration of the 4th century Egypt, focusing on its most emblematic buildings, offer a starting point for mapping key sites of interest for 4th century archaeology in a broader sense. It should be noted, however, that the material collecting during the excavation or survey of these sites usually corresponds to an occupation post-dating the construction of the building, and is rarely dated to the 4th century AD. The identification of chronological markers like coins, ostraca, papyri, or other dated material remains the most commonly used method for dating an archaeological context and its associated ceramics. These elements provide a terminus postquem or a terminus antequem, setting the chronological frame within which the assemblage being studied can be placed. In the catalogue of Noschke, Münzfunde aus Ägypten, the author counts more than 100,000 coins of the 4th century, but only a few of them are useful for dating a context, as the vast majority are surface finds, and it is now well known that they were in use for decades or even centuries after they were minted. For their part, written documents, such as ostraca and papyri, sometimes bear a date which, over and above the historical value of their content, provides an indication comparable to that of coins. When there are no coins or text to date an archaeological context directly, we have to rely on ceramic data. In Egypt, as elsewhere, the most widespread ceramics were logically the most regularly used, and their chronology is verifiable in different parts of the country. The analysis of their distribution is also useful for the study of the ancient economy. In this respect, fine tableware and amphora form the bulk of the corpus used to date archaeological levels. Ceramics imported from the Mediterranean coast play an important role in the periodization of Egyptian sites. We first look at the best known and most frequently cited production for dating late Roman levels in the Mediterranean world, the African red slipware. The African red slipware found in the 4th century context can be summarized in a few clearly identified types. For Egypt, a study published in 2012 identified the main types that we can find quite frequently in a period from the late 3rd to the early 5th century. Their types are indicated on the slide, and the map shows their distribution. As a counterpoint to the fineware, the African amphora that could evidence 4th century context can be summarized as African types 2C, 2D, and whose production is attested from the second half of the 3rd century, and key 25 African 3 and its variants, which were in circulation through the 4th century, and in the case of the later versions, until the middle of the 5th century. In addition to African products, imports from the Eastern Mediterranean began arriving in Egypt in greater numbers at the very end of the 4th century and during the first half of the 5th century. Regarding fineware, the so-called Chypriot slipware, particularly type 1 in ICE classification, is recognized in context dated from the end of the 4th through the 3rd quarter of the 5th century. The work of Henrik Meiza had led to the subdivision of this type into several variants, without any significant influence on its chronology. These variants align with the types observed in the Kelia, further reinforcing the proposed chronological framework. The appearance of Levantine amphora in Egyptian context at the interface with the 5th century heralded the phase in which this material is more and more present in the assemblages, especially in the Delta region. The most frequently observed type is the late Roman amphora 1. The identification of the predecessor of this form and its development during the 3rd and 4th century is still a matter of debate, to which the Egyptian finds now contribute. From the second half of the 3rd century, prototypes of late Roman amphora 1 reach Egypt, although the few known examples from Taposiris Magna, Komabubilu, and the Sinai indicate a limited distribution beyond the Egyptian coast. The most common types date from the very end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 5th century, as shown by their joint presence in Deposit A from the Kelia. Dominique Pieri has used this documentation to isolate a type, late Roman 1A, and a submodel of lesser capacity and to study their Mediterranean distribution. The second type, equally common in the assemblages, is the late Roman amphora 4 or Gaza amphora, which originated on the southern coast of the Palestinian region. Studies of its origin, development, and distribution have made it a well-known type. The 4th century variants distinguished by Dominique Pieri are recognizable by their inwardly projecting rim, which does not interrupt the general cylindrical shape of the body. They both correspond to Maishorek type 2, according to his classification based on Alexandrian excavations. Many other more sporadically attested types testified to imports of Eastern amphora. Their low frequency and especially their almost systematic occurrence alongside late Roman amphora 1 and 4 reduces their contribution to the chronological argument. We can, for example, note the regular presence of late Roman amphora 3 in the same context. Its characteristic hollow foot is frequently preserved, indicating a general type rather than a precise variant. Finally, there are a few Egyptian ceramics with a supra-regional distribution, whose production and distribution are rooted in the 4th century. Their number is quite remarkably limited, and they support a chronological demonstration only as last resort. The fineware produced at Aswan and the Egyptian red slipware A has long been of particular interest. Two types stand out for their frequency in the 4th and 5th century context. The type GT 608A, 608 and GT 210 as defined in Robert Gumpler's typology. Regarding amphora and other containers, the Egyptian amphora 3T1 and 3T2 are the most relevant instrument for dating between the second half of the 3rd and the beginning of the 5th century AD. There are still very few examples of these types, and their development have to be clarified, especially concerning the places where they were produced, as some may come from the Delta, while others would belong to Middle Egypt production centers. The Egyptian amphora 7 or late Roman amphora 7 produced in Middle Egypt cannot claim the same level of accuracy, despite its much wider distribution. Its presence has the advantage of providing a terminus postquem for the second half of the 4th century, but the variability of the type prevents any further precision. Only the evolution of the shoulder from a rounded to a carinated shape from the 6th century onwards make it possible to define a more reduced chronology on the basis of fairly complete examples. One last element deserves comment. This is a form of barrel or cigar that could have originated either in Aswan or in Bahia, although macroscopic examination does not allow a clear distinction from the clay paste. The work carried out at the Carretel Tube Fort now tend to favor the second hypothesis, which is also based on a tradition firmly rooted in the local and regional fasces. This type and probably some variants appear regularly in 4th and 5th century contexts in Egypt as well as outside. As a conclusion of this review, it becomes clear that while the ceramic described previously were indeed in circulation during the 4th century, their presence alone does not provide an evidence for a 4th century context. Each ceramic type, when considered independently, spans a broader chronological range, often encompassing both the last decades of the 3rd and the first decade of the 5th century. Since nothing begins in 300 AD and ends in 400 AD, I have to adopt a more flexible time frame, including such broader chronological window, in order to be able to report on the state of research in the 4th century. A review of the chronological markers and their context also highlights the limited number of pottery types that can support a dating to the first half of the 4th century AD. This can only be based on a few African productions, As 45, 46, 48, and above all 50A, African amphoras 2C, 2D, and possibly 3A and B, and the Egyptian amphoras 3T, which are only sporadically attested. Ongoing research on the first versions of late Roman amphora may eventually justify their inclusion as chronological markers for this period. Consequently, it is often challenging, if not impossible, to identify ceramic assemblages from the first half of the 4th century without support from non-ceramic chronological markers. The predominance of markers from the end of the 4th and 5th centuries, which are so much numerous than those from the preceding period, may have conducted to an under-representation of 4th century contexts in the archaeological records. In short, we could have concluded that there was no 4th century context simply because we lacked arguments. In the next phase of this research, I turn directly to the archaeological sources to select the most valuable context from which to extract information about ceramic evolution during the 4th century. This involved a critical assessment of several key factors: the nature of the sites, the nature of the context excavated, and how the documentation was presented. They all emphasize the limitations of documentation. A significant barrier to understanding ceramic productions lies in the lack of excavated production centers. To date, only one site from the 4th century, Ain el-Gedida in the Dakhla Oasis, has been published, and even there the kilns were not excavated. Without such data, it is impossible to connect ceramics found in the consumption sites to their respective workshops, or to analyze the supply dynamics on various scales. This absence of a clear starting point hinders our ability to identify production processes and to analyze their diversity and evolution. In terms of prioritizing context, abandonment or destruction layers preserving material in situ within a closed context are most valuable. Unfortunately, this scenario is rare, as many sites were revisited or reused at a later date. A favorable situation was observed in the Great Oasis, not due to a sudden event, but to a gradual depopulation during the second half of the 4th century. The Fayum likely experienced a similar depopulation process, but archaeological investigations have been more limited, both in scope and scale, compared to those in Dakhla and Rarga. Another example of abandonment can be found in the Theban region, likely linked to a single yet unexplained event. Extensive excavations at the Temple of Ptah area in Karnak provide a rare glimpse of late Roman settlements, On the Red Sea, the fort of Abu Shar should offer comparable data, but its material remains unpublished. Stratified contexts are also crucial as they provide chronologically distinct documentation between earlier and later states, enabling diachronic analysis of ceramic evolution. However, elements within these layers are rarely in situ, especially in test pits. Many archaeological projects yield stratified levels, but their relevance to this study depends on how the results are presented. Surveys are secondary sources, but still valuable. They identify areas suitable for further research and provide some ceramic markers that reveal the potential of the future discoveries. However, the scope is insufficient to provide a comprehensive understanding of regional production. The format of publication also shapes the state of research and the question that can be addressed. Synthesis on African ceramics or Levantine amphora in Egypt are achievable through partial documentation and introductory articles that highlight these products. Achieving a similar depth of knowledge for storage vessel is more challenging, despite this form being far more common in Egyptian assemblages than fineware and amphora. In this respect, the Great Oasis again stands out. Decades of discoveries and continuous research have resulted in numerous chapters and monographs detailing the finds, making the corpus representative of the actual assemblages. Similar corpora exist for the other regions, but few focus extensively or exclusively on the 4th century, and most are based on partial publications, which complicates again comparisons. A selection of sites is therefore naturally made from the list mentioned before and according to previously discussed criteria, prioritizing those with well-preserved remains and accessible documentation. The inventory of context suitable for analyzing 4th century pottery that you can see now highlights the extensive excavations conducted in the Great Oasis, especially in Dakhla, which alone accounts for nearly half of the corpus. This selection reveals a geography unique to our understanding of ancient Egypt. A marginally located but well-preserved area that has become central to our study of ceramic production of the 4th century, while the Nile Valley provides only limited documentation for our purposes. This imbalance with the Nile Valley cannot be addressed simply by broadening our selection criteria. In some instances, I chose to include studies that present only a part of the material, where the dating of the assemblage is still debated, or may lean more toward the decades before or after the 4th century AD, in order to establish reasonable, if imperfect, points of comparison. Coastal sites along the Red Sea are underrepresented due to the limited publication of finds from those areas. As soon as we know where the suitable context for the study of the 4th century ceramics are, we can now enter the details of the ceramic productions themselves. I will focus on the most emblematic regional productions to add possible other markers from this period. The Great Oasis provides the most reliable evidence for the 4th century, so I will begin this survey with the emblematic production from there, the Oasis red slipware and the Rarga yellow slipware. Oasis red slipwares are to be considered as a local limitation of the African red slipwares. They are known only from evidence at consumption sites in the Rarga and Darla Oasis. This production was the subject of a pioneering study based on the material found at Douche, to the south of the Rarga Oasis, which has now been refined through work on various sites in Dakhla and Rarga. More or less faithful copies of African red slipware would have been part of the early development of the Oasis red slipware. We can notice that if such type appear in late 3rd or early 4th century in Rarga, notably in Douche and at Chapseldin, such ceramic types are all dated to the second half of the 4th century in Dakhla, as evidenced in Ain el-Gedida, Ameida, or Ismet el-Kharam. The hemispherical bowls or cups of a small module classified as type 20 to 22 in Rodievich typology, so this is this one, are the most common. The variability of the profiles are gradually contributed to a certain confusion in the reference to the types themselves, while at the same time we can infer an evolution of the type in the course of the 4th century AD. In short, the thinner and sharper rim are found in various contexts, from the late 3rd to the late 4th century, while thicker shapes seem to be only present in contexts dated to the second half of the 4th century and later. The second half of the 4th century also saw the emergence of molded lamps, although the exact date of origin remains unclear. Similarities can be seen with African lamps as well as with Egyptian productions from the 3rd and 4th century. Their shapes and dimensions vary widely, as illustrated by 2 examples found together in the same context at Shams el-Din. Another emblematic production of the 4th century in the Great Oasis is the Rarga yellow slipware. A workshop producing this ware was located at Taoun al-Hawa to the north of the Rarga Oasis, but the scope of this discovery is limited by the lack of excavation and illustration of the types observed in situ. The Rarga yellow slipware is made with the kaolinitic clay used for common wares. Some examples have been found in the early levels of the Shams el-Din temple dating to the last quarter of the 3rd century, as well as in the early phase 3 at Dush and at Ain el-Lapaha. The yellow slip partially or fully coats the surface of the pottery, and the vessel profiles are reminiscent of form already in use during the Roman period. These shapes reflect the development of a fashion for yellow slip ceramics, rooted in a pre-existing typology. In the levels dated of the second half of the 4th century, carenated bow with painted interlaced and twisted designs are fairly common. The iconographic repertoire of the yellow slipware is notably more diversified in the Rarga Oasis. The proximity of workshops play a crucial role in understanding the diversity within this production. The morphology of the wine bottles is quite different from earlier levels. The development of the Rarga production centers during the 4th century therefore highlights exchanges within the Great Oasis, while also providing important chronological milestones. However, this production remains essentially confined to the regional sphere, and export of Rarga products beyond its immediate periphery is exceptional. Excavations conducted so far in Alexandria, the Delta, and surrounding areas offer only a very limited view of the corpus of the 4th century pottery. These levels are rarely reached in stratified context, and when they are, publications tend to prioritize illustration of fine wares and amphora over more common wares. As a result, we have a much clearer understanding of imported products in the area than those produced locally. Chronologically, the transitional period between the late 3rd and mid-4th century is not well reflected in the archaeological records. Most finds that are tentatively included in the 4th century chronology date from the second half of the 4th, often mixed with ceramics more securely dated to the 5th century. It must be admitted that the production I am about to discuss probably circulated between the mid-4th century and the first half of the 5th century, without any significant change that would allow a greater precision. I would like to clarify a particularly important point about the imitation of African fine wares in Egyptian territory. I will go quickly on the historiography of the various terms, just to draw equivalence between a generic group K, as established by Rodievich at Komel-Dicker, and Egyptian red slipware B, as named by John Ice. They all designate fine red slipwares made from Nile clay, whatever their region of production. When addressing the regional production of such broad category, one would refer to Egyptian red slipware H, as termed by Donald Bailey from Middle Egyptian production, and reserve the use of group K prime for production supposedly from the Delta. If the question of the origin of group K prime remains open, that of its chronology is even more uncertain. It is certainly attested in large numbers in context from the first half of the 5th century, as shown by the work carried out at Kom el Ahmer. There are very few sites that could shed light on their first appearances. The most convincing data can be found in the Eastern Delta in the levels of the Roman camp at Tel El, dated to the second half of the 4th century AD. The test pits at Kom el DEChriM remain the only sources providing chronologically comparable documentation for this category. Rodevich identifies a phase extending from the 4th to the mid-5th century AD, during which only one type of Group K production, a ball with a straight rim, this one, is attested. The absence of parallels for this type on a regional scale prevents verification of the proposed dating, likely due to the scarcity of comparably dated contexts. Additionally, this type does not appear in a relatively extensive corpus from Middle Egypt, lending further support to the hypothesis of its delta origin. Several clues support the hypothesis that lamps were produced in Alexandria. The first indication lies in the type of clay used. In his initial classification of lamps spanning the Ptolemaic to the late Roman periods, John Ice described a light brown calcareous fabric associated with late production in Alexandrian workshops. Similarly, in a study of lamps from late 4th to early 5th century context at Kom el DEChriM, Mlynarczyk identified examples with identical microscopic fixtures, likely sources from the Mareotic region, or at least the Alexandrian coast. The discovery of a batch of 40 unfired lamps and a mold during the excavation at the Serapeum further suggests the presence of local workshops. The consistency in descriptions and alignment with Mareotic products points strongly towards local Alexandrian production, for which archaeology has so far only provided indirect evidence. Additionally, the recurrence of certain lamp types, especially in context from the late 4th to early 5th century AD, supports this hypothesis. 4 of them are regularly observed in Alexandria, but more widely in the Delta, with some examples found as far as south of the Fayum. They all belong to type Bronner 28. More than their type, their iconography has long been discussed, as some Christian and Jewish motifs can be found in the same context at Kom el DEChriM. As with the Delta, the published documentation from archaeological work in the Fayum and Middle Egypt does not allow us to study in detail the production of the 4th century AD. The inventory of context relevant to our study reveals significant gaps, compelling us to rely on chronological hypotheses that remain under debate, particularly regarding the emergence of finewares and amphora, which were extensively produced in the 5th century. As with the Delta again, there is no clear division to separate assemblages from the late 4th century from those to the early 5th century. Imported markers are scarce, particularly Eastern productions, leaving chronological dating reliant on the terminus postquem established by numismatic evidence or written documents. Consequently, a 4th century date is often suggested rather than conclusively proven, and is sometimes even contested as finds are re-evaluated, as in the case of Karanis. This typical uncertainty in the dating of production is particularly evident when dealing with the Egyptian red slipware H of Middle Egypt. Workshops were recognized at Hermopolis El Ashmunain, as well as Antinopolis and Zawiyat El Mayetin, each time related to amphora production. Due to the limited work at these production sites, only part of the repertoire has been documented and published. The remaining evidence comes from nearby consumption sites. Since reference levels generally date no earlier than the late 4th century, the illustrated typology better reflects production developments during the Byzantine period. However, a very few types might be diagnostic of a 4th century production. For example, a faithful copy of the ICE 50A, so this one, originally dated to the late 3rd to the mid-4th century, is found on the surface at the site of Philoteuris and Teptinis in the Fayum, but also on the surface at Komel Kenissa, south of the sacred area of Hermopolis. Other types are generally observed in late 4th, mid-5th century context in Hermopolis, at Ribis and Antinopolis. They are all copies of exemplar already being distributed during the 4th century, so they might be produced during this period. A rather marginal production in Middle Egypt is quite interesting, as it could be part of the pottery distributed as far as the Delta. Pascal Ballet, during a survey at Hermopolis, noted numerous overfied costrel in marl clay. Other examples were found in the kilnvaster of Antinopolis. She then made the connection with the marl costrel in the Kelia, in context dating from the late 4th and 5th century AD. Moreover, the attribution of Kelia types to Middle Egyptian workshops has supported the hypothesis of a broader extra-regional distribution for these productions. Consequently, specimens found in the Delta are sometimes viewed as imports from Middle Egypt. They have been documented in Alexandria, in the Kelia, and even in the Wadi Natrun and the Dakhla Oasis, all of them in context dated from the second half of the 4th to the first half of the 5th century. Other variants, always linked to example excavated at Hermopolis, are found in level dating from the second half of the 4th century at Tel El and Tel El Farama. We cannot make definitive conclusions without further studies on Hermopolis and Antinopolis workshops. However, our survey of the attestations reveals consistent variations within the type identified by Pascal Ballet, confined to a chronological horizon of a few decades, and aligns to other forms with the known corpus from Middle Egypt. I have already briefly addressed the amphora production from Middle Egypt, especially the doubts we have about Egyptian amphora 3T, which are likely produced there, but maybe also in the Delta. Egyptian amphora 7 seems to have been produced in Middle Egypt from the mid-4th century onward, but we still lack evidence from the kiln area, which need to be investigated further. I will now shift to Upper Egypt. While Nile seed fabrics often dominate pottery assemblages, Upper Egypt is also known for marl and kyanite clay, especially in Roman and Byzantine contexts. Despite the lack of confirmed 4th century production centers, documentation from consumption sites allow a fairly accurate inventory of vessels distributed beyond local areas, with Aswan pottery integrated into a wider economic network. As mentioned previously, we still have a better knowledge of the context of the second half of the 4th century and early 5th century to assess pottery production. The Theban marl clay and related productions is highly regionalized between Coptos in the north and Tod in the south. The production centers have not yet been discovered, but it is strongly suspected that Medamud is one of them. The study of Kiln West has already confirmed that marl clay was used for production between the New Kingdom and the Roman period. Recent surveys have revealed production area for the Byzantine period. So research is now focusing on the location of the late Roman kilns, which, if not destroyed by the Sebachim, may be located in a still unexplored area on the edge of the site. In any case, the Theban marl clay productions we are dealing with are fully integrated into a local fasces, and we can follow their development between the Roman and the early Byzantine periods, thanks to the excavation at Tod, Karnak, and Coptos. In fact, it is from the first centuries of our era that the most striking elements of this production seems to have been established. The typology presented here comes from the well-preserved level of the Temple of Ptah at Karnak, dated towards the end of the 4th, early 5th century AD. When looking for parallels in the region, one might emphasize that there is no evolution of the ceramic types since the Roman period. The typological repertoire thus seems to fall into the category of commonwares for everyday use, and not as tableware, that were likely imported from Aswan, as seen in the Karnak excavation. Egyptian red slipware A is the most popular Egyptian production imitating African fine wares. In spite of various studies that have led to the identification of clay sources and different production areas, we are still unable to relate the typology observed in the consumption sites to specific workshops or to carry out a diachronic study of the evolution of the production centers. For the 4th century, certain types closely resemble widely distributed African wares from this period. They are commonly found in levels dating to the second half of the 4th century and the early 5th century. There are also other forms whose African reference is not immediate, or quite simply, whose origin is completely different. According to the latest work carried out in Aswan, such shapes are considered to be markers of the 4th century. In a phase spanning the second half of the 3rd century and the first half of the 4th century, the author identified convex cup, whose development was followed through the Roman period. The piriform cup are found in the same context and mark this transitional fasces between the Roman period and late antiquity. From the second half of the 4th century onwards, the most commonly observed types are the one I discussed before. I just add the hemispherical ball GT 316, whose surface is generally covered with a white slip with 2 black bands on the inside, which petrographic analysis attribute to a different clay deposit. Our knowledge of late Roman pottery from the Eastern Desert suggests that most of the ceramics used came from the Nile Valley. This is not a well-defined corpus, as the documentation generally comes from survey, and the assemblages from the excavation of interest to this study remain largely unpublished, except for Berenike. I will therefore not dwell on their case. So far, I have dealt only superficially with 4th century ceramics, highlighting important markers to help identify potential remains from this period, and then illustrating emblematic productions that could serve as chronological markers on a regional scale. I could say that most of the work has been done, since the original idea was to provide dating tools to help identify remains that could be dated to the 4th century. But I wanted to go further and try to integrate all the documentation, the fine wares, the common wares, and the amphora, into historical, cultural, and social issues. I can tell you right away that I didn't get very far because there are so many gaps. On the one hand, there are the things we haven't found or excavated, such as the production centers or kilns. It is possible to follow a line of reasoning based on data from the Roman period, but our interpretations will remain highly hypothetical. There are also aspects we do not study or present. While these omissions don't hinder us for addressing most of the usual questions, they leave significant gaps when aiming for a comprehensive synthesis. I'd like to spend the last few minutes of this talk illustrating the questions I wish I could have explored further if the necessary documentation were available, and highlighting the data that were missing for this purpose. Most ceramic classifications are based on the clay type, the main inclusions and texture of samples collected during excavations. This approach provides a standard reference and supports future archaeometric analysis of ceramic composition. However, given the current state of documentation, making side-to-side comparisons within the same region remains challenging. Efforts to link clay type, pottery forms, and production sites are hampered by the lack of data on production centers. Such an approach also often obscures the relationship between clay composition and pottery function at the consumption sites under study. I think it would be easier to adapt our methodology to what we have at hand, rather than expect Egyptian archaeology to suddenly devote itself to researching production centers. Because the specialization of clay mixing is reflected in our classification. Each system has a prominent commonware for pottery types typically made from the most commonly found clay and used for multiple adaptable functions. At Darla, this is the sandy clays with ferruginous inclusions. At Traga, the caulinitic clays with shells. In the Nile Valley, alluvial clay dominates, while in Aswan, this is the pink caulinitic clays. Examining functional categories alongside the existing classifications provide first information about the choices and adaptations of the clay mixtures used by the potters. These classifications reflect the preparation of clay to suit specific shapes and functions while simplifying the sorting of archaeological pottery by aligning functional groups with fabric types. For instance, tableware is usually distinguished by a fine clay and red slip. In the Nile Valley, most cooking wares are produced from alluvial clay with a mineral temple. Porosity is the main characteristic of the clay mixture selected for water and storage vessels. By emphasizing the connection between clay composition and the intended function of pottery, we gain a deeper insight into the pottery practices and regional adaptations. Turning to tableware, I'd like to introduce a topic that is increasingly being discussed in Egypt, the way a segment of a local elite reproduced the Roman practice of the convivium. These banquets are widely described by Roman authors. They emphasize the social status of the host through the splendor of the room in which he entertains and in the food and drink he serves to his guests. This brings us to the question of how much ceramic data can reveal about these social practices. Most classifications identify a category of fineware previously discussed in detail. These vessels, imitating African wares, were widely distributed in Egypt from the 4th century. In regions without local production, such as the Theban region, these wares were imported from Aswan or Middle Egypt. Viewing these imitations as functional substitute for the original African pottery would underline how Roman fashion gradually spread to all levels of society. In one sense, such finewares could be part of a kind of local convivium for important events such as weddings, sometimes not. But we know from archaeology that the practice of the Roman convivium was part of a culturally established practice in Egyptian society. Imported products, especially amphora, also reflect a similar pattern. Even remote sites could acquire goods originating from across the Mediterranean once they reach Egyptian territory. The roads were made especially for that purpose. Access to foreign goods depended more on the social status and influence of the recipient than on local distribution channels. Alexandria, abundant access to imports. I put you the statistics here for the European system. So Alexandria, abundant access to imports was probably due to export access and also the presence of political and economic elite. While it is relatively easy to identify the ceramics used for meals that had strong social connotations, it is difficult to illustrate the ceramics used for everyday meals. They could be the same as before, or we could look for the common dishes and bowls. What also about the decorated bread plates that are regularly found? I put you here an example at Karnak. I don't know, I can't say if they highlight a common or an exceptional bread preparation. There is a lot of research to be done here, starting with the best preserved context. Let's consider the kitchen through one of its most familiar elements for us, the cooking wares. Culinary ceramics are generally categorized separately in classifications. Other clay mixtures are specially selected for their refractory properties, making them ideal for cooking. In Dakhla, alongside the main clay group A1, a caulinitic clay group A11 was used from the late 3rd century, primarily for cooking pottery. At Ain el-Gedida, Delphine 19 suggests this clay was used by local potters, who produced not only cooking vessels but also jugs, flasks, and small bowls. Notably, some of these shapes appear influenced by the Eastern model. such as those with characteristic beveled rim, as we can see in the delta at the end of the 4th and more frequently in the 5th century. In the Nile Valley, cooking pottery were almost exclusively produced with refined Nile clay. These clays were either rich in natural mineral inclusions or tempered with sand to achieve similar properties. This practice, following Hellenistic way, became a common practice in Egyptian pottery, as well as across the Eastern Mediterranean. In Aswan, where Calonitic clay held similar refractory properties to those in the Great Oasis, local potters adopted Nile clays for producing cooking vessels. Each region developed its own typology, yet distinct profiles emerged that link Egyptian cookware with Roman tradition that themselves descended from Hellenistic forms. For example, vessels resembling Roman kakabe, this one or patina, serve various cooking functions, facilitating slow-cooked stews and frying. Despite these connections, we lack the quantitative data to fully understand the functional variety of cooking wares, as well as residue analysis that could reveal more about Egyptian culinary practices. Before reaching a kitchen, food was generally transported over short or long distance that are difficult to trace, but most importantly, it was stored here in or near dwellings. The question of the ceramics used to store foodstuff has recently been revisited by the research group on storage in ancient Egypt and Nubia. You have the link in the slide below. The small capacity of ceramics leads to focus on foodstuffs stored in small quantities and more generally on domestic storage. The main distinction that can be made is between devices for long-term storage and those which are much more numerous in our corpus, which indicate temporary storage and perform an ordinary pantry function. This division only becomes clear when it is based on the presence of a seal. Archaeology also illustrates other strategy for distinguishing between pottery set into the ground and pottery stored in what may have been storage rooms. Keeping perishable goods at a constant temperature obviously makes them easier to preserve. In these systems, the shape of the pottery plays a secondary role, as we are now well aware of the multiple and changing uses of the ceramics. The diameter of the opening and the capacity of the vessels can provide some clues to determine the nature of the contents, whether liquid or solid, stored in small or large quantities, but the identification of the foodstuff stored depends entirely on residue analysis and on archaeobotanical studies, which are still too rarely carried out. We can only really study storage strategies if we have a better idea of what was stored. There are many other issues that need to be addressed, especially regarding the use of specialized ceramics in rural context, those found in necropolises and those reused in architecture. However, time is running, and I still need to make progress with this research. I would therefore like to conclude by summarizing key gaps that limit our ability to achieve historical insight from ceramics. The first is the exhaustive publication of the assemblages when they come from well-documented contexts. We still lack a means of sharing all field documentation when it goes beyond the format of article or monograph. We are all under pressure to publish, which leads us to select the more salient elements, maybe too quickly, without giving enough importance to what we don't understand. The second aspect concerns our ability to establish equivalence in our classification system, which hinders synthesis and comparison. Everyone will want to keep their own, but we need to build bridges, as it has been done in the Theban region and in the Dakhla Oasis. This should make it easier to publish statistics from counting on the same basis. It is worth noting that the most recent publications already present these principles and bring the documentation up to date, as if we were making a fresh start. Because if all the documentation of the last 50 years had contained all this documentation, all this information, believe me, I would have made a completely different presentation. Thank you for your attention.